Thank you, Ron, for that introduction, and hello to everyone. Tonight, we'll begin Chapter 5, and I think everyone is pretty familiar with this story. It's the story that gave birth to that famous idiom, "You can see the writing on the wall," and all the derivations of that phrase. And we'll get into that real soon. Last week, we finished Chapter 4, and it was Nebuchadnezzar's very own testimonial about how God had worked with him during his reign. You could say that it was the rise and fall and rise again of King Nebuchadnezzar, written in his own words. Nebuchadnezzar likely wrote this near the end of his life, and he died in 562 BC, at the age of 83 or 84. He reigned for 43 years. If he began his reign in 605, that is, commentaries differ slightly when it comes to the beginning of his official reign. Chapter 5 takes place in 539 BC, right at the very close of the Babylonian Empire. That is, about 23 years after Chapter 4. Chronologically, Chapters 7 and 8 occur before Chapter 5. Chapter 7 takes place in the first year of Belshazzar, and Chapter 8 takes place in the third year of Belshazzar, and I have no idea why this chapter precedes Chapter 7 and 8. Belshazzar didn't become king right after Nebuchadnezzar's death. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, his son, Evil Merodach, became king. Yep, that was his name, Evil Merodach, and he's mentioned in 2 Kings 25. Let's go there and read it, beginning in verse 27 of 2 Kings 25. This is in the King James Version. "And it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, that Evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, did lift up the head of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, out of prison." Verse 28, "And he spake kindly to him, and he set his throne above the throne of the kings that were with him in Babylon." Verse 29, "And he changed his prison garments, and he did eat bread continually before him all the days of his life. And his allowance was a continual allowance given him of the king, a daily rate for every day, all the days of his life." This act of kindness toward Jehoiachin might have come about because of the good example his father set after his conversion. At least one commentary speculated that Evil Merodach may also have been converted, which might have explained his empathy toward Jehoiachin. That's according to one commentary, anyway. If in fact Nebuchadnezzar's son, Evil Merodach, was a good man, he didn't make a very good impression on his brother-in-law, Neriglissar, who assassinated Evil Merodach in 559 BC. Neriglissar is mentioned in the Bible as well, but his Bible name is Nergal-Sharezer, and he's mentioned in Jeremiah 39. Here's what it says. Jeremiah 39:11. "Now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had given these orders about Jeremiah through Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard. Take him and look after him. Don't harm him, but do for him whatever he asks." Verse 13. So Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, and Nebushazban, chief officer, Nergal-Sharezer, a high official, and all the other officials of the king of Babylon, sent and had Jeremiah taken out of the courtyard of the guard. They turned him over to Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, to take him back to his home. So he remained among his own people. So Evil Merodach was assassinated after 2 years by his brother-in-law Neriglissar, after which he ascended to the throne and reigned for about 4 years. Then, when Neriglissar made himself king, war broke out with the Medes and the Persians, and Neriglissar was killed in battle in about 556 BC. When Neriglissar died, his son became king. His name was Laboro-so-Archad, and from what I've read in several commentaries, he was just a child, but they never give his age. Another commentary gives his name as Labashi Marduk, which is a whole lot easier to pronounce. Anyway, this young boy was king for only 9 months when he was beaten to death by conspirators. And one of those conspirators became the next king, and his name was Nabonidus, and he reigned from 555 BC until he was defeated by Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. And it's important to note he was one of Nebuchadnezzar's sons-in-law. But what about Belshazzar? He was the last king, wasn't he? Wasn't he the one who saw the writing on the wall? Well, yes and yes. Here's what's going on. This chapter was always under a lot of scrutiny because there was no extra-biblical evidence that Belshazzar was ever the king of Babylon. The Bible was the only place he was mentioned. But in 1854, John George Taylor, who was a British official in their foreign service, as well as an archaeologist, uncovered some important antiquities in the Middle East. He was one of the first archaeologists to explore some of the prominent burial grounds around the Persian Gulf. Among his discoveries were 4 cuneiform cylinders that were in the foundation of a ziggurat at Ur. A ziggurat was a large building which was part of a temple complex, and this one happened to be in Ur of the Chaldeans, and it was purported to be the temple of the moon god, Sin, who was also known as Nana. And this was apparently Nabonidus' god of choice. This was in the area where Abraham and his family came from, Ur of the Chaldeans. These cuneiform cylinders were all identical, and they became known as the Nabonidus cylinders, or the cylinders of Nabonidus, curiously enough. Nabonidus described how he had repaired the structures of various temples in Ur and some other nearby cities, but the real significance of this cuneiform record for our purposes is that he mentions Belshazzar as his son. Here's a quote from the cuneiform cylinder as it was translated. "As for me, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, save me from sinning against your great Godhead, and grant me a present, a long life of days. And for Belshazzar, my eldest son, my offspring, instill reverence for your great Godhead in his heart. May he not commit any cultic mistake. May he be sated with a life of plenitude." This historical finding establishes the fact that Belshazzar was indeed the son of Nabonidus, who was Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law. And that's from Wikipedia.org under the heading of Cylinders of Nabonidus. So, Nabonidus is the Babylonian king until the very end, but he's absent from Babylon for a number of years. And while he's gone, Belshazzar, his son, was the acting king or regent king. Nabonidus spent much of his time in Tema, a city in Arabia south of Edom, which he captured, and he established his palace there. The oasis city was located on some lucrative Arabian trade routes which he could control, and it was thought that he was able to acquire a great amount of wealth while living there. It's not clear why he spent so much time there, which was about 10 years from 553 to 543 BC. One commentator speculated that he may not have felt at home in Babylon because of his desire to worship the moon god, Sin, who is also known as Nana, whereas in Babylon the principal god was Marduk, and he may have rejected Marduk. In his absence, Belshazzar had full control of Babylon from 553 BC until it was overthrown in 539 BC. So now that we've established the fact that Belshazzar was the reigning king or regent king, let's go to Jeremiah 27:7, which mentions the 3 principal kings of the Babylonian Empire recognized by Jeremiah. Jeremiah 27:7. "All nations will serve him and his grandson until the time for his land comes. Then many nations and great kings will subjugate him." This is referring to Nebuchadnezzar, his son Evil-Merodach, and his grandson Belshazzar. and it's also a prophecy of the Babylonian demise. This 5th chapter of Daniel marks the end of the Babylonian Empire. The date correlates to October 12th and 13th of 539 BC, and it was the 15th of Tishri on the Jewish calendar, which just happened to be the first evening and day of the Feast of Tabernacles. Coincidentally, or not, the Feast of Tabernacles is a feast that commemorates in advance the setting up of a new government. Specifically, it commemorates the coming kingdom of God when Jesus Christ will reign from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. Not that the Persian Empire is symbolic or analogous in any way of Christ's kingdom, but the destruction of the Babylonian Empire happening on the eve of the Feast of Tabernacles may be symbolic of the time when Jesus returns and destroys all the reigning earthly governments prior to setting up his kingdom. So let's begin reading chapter 5. Daniel 5:1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Okay, so he throws a party for 1,000 of his closest friends. That wasn't all that unusual for kings to have huge banquets. Ctesias, who was an ancient historian, wrote that Persian kings often dined with as many as 15,000 people every day. You'll remember that in the first chapter of Esther, King Xerxes had a celebration to display and show off all of his great power and wealth, and it lasted 180 days. That was probably like the World's Fair of his day, and then after the 180 days had passed, he gave a banquet that lasted 7 days, and that was to show off his Queen Vashti. And you know the story. It didn't work out so well for the queen, but it paved the way for Esther. Most commentaries make the observation that the size of this little soiree wasn't as surprising as the timing of it. They had to know that the Persians were on the march because Nabonidus had just gone out to fight them a few days earlier. And don't forget, everyone had spies and runners back then, especially during a pending invasion. In fact, at this point, the armies of Cyrus had already conquered the surrounding regions, and all of the nobles who were able to escape fled to the safety of the walled city of Babylon to wait out the battle. Verse 2. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Belshazzar refers to Nebuchadnezzar as his father, mainly because there's not a word for grandfather or grandson in Aramaic or Hebrew. But aside from that, this seems to be pretty common usage of the word father throughout the Bible. Abraham is often referred to as Father Abraham, and when talking about the various kings in Judah and Israel, sometimes the text says something along the lines of, and so did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done. Also, in Jesus' very own genealogy in Matthew 1, verse 1, it says, "This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." So it's not at all unusual or misleading for Daniel to call Nebuchadnezzar Belshazzar's father. But back to the party they were having. This wasn't your basic church social, and there may have been a couple of reasons for partying so enthusiastically. Those who were normally stationed away from Babylon were now back in town because of the advancing armies. And that could have been a reason for the celebration. Or maybe there's a fatalistic air about the palace on this night. Maybe things don't feel quite so right. Remember, back in the late 1990s when everyone thought the world as we knew it was going to end on New Year's Eve in 1999? Because computers weren't set up to handle the year 2000. Remember that? And remember that song, 1999, by the artist formerly known as Prince? He might be known as Prince once again, I don't know. But here are the lyrics of the chorus. 2000, party over, end of time. So tonight we're going to party like it's 1999. Anyone remember that? Well, maybe Gary could hum a few bars during the break. Maybe Belshazzar and all the partygoers, in their heart of hearts, knew time was short. So maybe they thought, let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Maybe he thought this might be the last opportunity to toast his very own pagan gods with the wine in the goblets Nebuchadnezzar had respectfully kept in storage. Maybe he thought this would make a great impression on all the guests. Or maybe Belshazzar was just arrogant and too plastered to have any decent judgment left. Whatever the reason for the debauched revelries, this was going to be the party to end all parties. Quite literally, at least in Babylon. Verse 3. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. Verse 4. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. This was obviously sacrilegious. This was like a direct challenge to God. It was like saying, I'm toasting my gods with your golden vessels. What are you going to do about it? And notice which gods they are praising and toasting. They're praising the materials or gods of the materials that were used in the building of the city walls and the structures of Babylon. That's what they were putting their trust in to save them from the Persians. And Babylon was a great city, just like Nineveh was. There are conflicting reports about the proportions of the walls, but by any account, they were massive. The ancient historian Herodotus reported the walls to be 350 feet high, 87 feet thick, and with 100 brass gates, and each side being 14 miles long, and it spanned the Euphrates River. But modern archaeologists believe those measurements to be exaggerated, maybe by as much as 75%. And this would be a good place to take a break, so let's do that. Here's Gary.
How is it possible for a free people who enjoy all the benefits of liberty to lose it all, to lay their freedom down? Write or call and ask for a free CD, How Freedom is Lost. Write to Born to Win, Post Office Box 560, White House, Texas 75791. Or call toll-free 1-888-BIBLE-44.
Okay, even if Herodotus didn't get the dimensions of the city correct, it was still pretty massive. Bible.org describes the city this way. The great Euphrates River flowed through the middle of the city in a general north-south direction, and it was bordered by walls on each side to protect the city from attack from the river. Within these walls were beautiful avenues, parks, and palaces. Many of the streets were lined with buildings 3 or 4 stories high. Among these buildings were the Temple of Bel, an 8-story structure, and the magnificent palace of the king, actually a complex of buildings, which now have been excavated. A great bridge spanned the Euphrates River, connecting the eastern section and the western section, or new section of the city. The bridge was later supplemented by a tunnel mentioned by Diodorus. The famed Hanging Gardens of Babylon were large enough to support trees. Although Babylon has only been partially excavated, with but a small part of the original city recovered, the system of mounds which mark the city today more or less indicates its boundaries. Archaeological research is complicated by a change in the course of the Euphrates River and a higher water level, but more than 10,000 inscribed texts have been discovered. In many respects, Babylon was the most fabulous city of the ancient world for both the beauty of its architecture and for the safety of its huge walls and fortifications. It was hard for the Babylonians to believe that even the Medes and Persians who had surrounded their beloved city could possibly breach the fortifications or exhaust their supplies, which were intended to be ample for a siege of many years. Their confidence in their gods was bolstered by their confidence in their city. Now verse 5. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. The Barnes commentary speculates that this lampstand may have been from the temple in Jerusalem and was used here to shine light on the handwritten message from God. Bob Conway of decodingdaniel.com says this about the lampstand. It's likely that the lampstand came from the holy place of God's temple. Among other things, this article typifies judgment, which is symbolic of God's light exposing good and evil. In the New Testament, there are 7 golden lampstands that appear in the midst of the 7 churches of Asia Minor. The lampstands symbolize the scrutiny of Christ as he reveals his commendations and condemnations of the 7 churches. Revelation 2 and 3. Here the light from the lampstand illuminated the king's face, the writing hand, and the writing on the wall. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. Verse 6. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. Nebuchadnezzar was always troubled and even terrified by his dreams. But poor Belshazzar collapsed and lost all control. Although, we're not sure how well he was able to stand even before this frightening sight. At this point, he might not have passed a sobriety test. His behavior for the entire evening was conduct unbecoming for a king. And this episode of abject weakness caused him to be completely humiliated in the presence of the nobles, his wives and concubines, and possibly the queen mother who was in the other room. This was a sorry excuse for a king, even if the empire was collapsing. But he exemplified the depravity and degeneration of a failed king in an empire during its last hours. Verse 7. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he'll be made 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom." Now, Belshazzar wasn't able to offer anyone the 2nd highest position because he was still number 2. His father was still the official king, and Belshazzar was the regent king in his absence. Verse 8. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. In verse 9, I'm not sure if the nobles were baffled because of the so-called wise men weren't able to translate the writing on the wall, or if they were baffled at the king for becoming even more terrified. Notice the next verse, verse 10. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale." Most assume this is the queen mother and not the king's wife or queen. Either she's the mother of the king or his grandmother, neither of whom would likely be present at this kind of party where the wives and the concubines are in attendance, which is why she came into the room and wasn't already there. The Clark commentary says this could have been the widow of Nebuchadnezzar, which would have been Belshazzar's grandmother. I'm tending to lean in that direction. His mother would be the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar and the wife of Nabonidus, but he's been in Tama in Arabia for 10 years and only recently returned to Babylon to battle the armies of Cyrus. She may even still be in Tama,